Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on mindfulness in today's changing world. My name is Sarah Speltz, and I'm an Associate Director in the BU Alumni Relations Office. Today's webinar is sponsored by the Boston University Alumni Association and is offered as part of our alumni education programming. Many of our educational programs are held on campus, but we offer educational webinars because we want to connect with our alumni around the globe. And we do have alumni joining us today from a lot of places. This is really exciting. Austria, Canada, Finland, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Lebanon, Malaysia, Morocco, Netherlands, New Zealand, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, as well as many places throughout the United States. We're so happy to have you all with us. I can't even begin to imagine what time it is where all of you are, so thank you for being here. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Chris is a 2000 graduate of BU School of Social Work, and she's currently the lead faculty for behavioral science at Northeastern University. Dr. Kristen Lee, her research and teaching interests include individual and organizational well-being and resilience, particularly for marginalized and underserved populations. She is the author of Reset, Make the Most of Your Stress, and Mentalligence, a new psychology of learning. Learn what it takes to be more agile, mindful, and connected in today's world. Her TEDx talk, The Risk You Must Take, has over 305,000 views. She's a regular contributor for Thrive Global, Huffington Post, and Psychology Today. Chris's work has been featured on NPR and CBS Radio, and she travels widely to speak on the global mental health crisis, focusing on cultivating resilience across our professional and personal lives. Dr. Kristen Lee, thanks so much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Today, I'm really excited to share some perspectives on mindfulness. And as we get underway, I wanted to share some of the guiding questions that will help shape our work together today. What is mindfulness, and how can I apply it in this changing world? And certainly mindfulness has sort of become this new kale, right? It's sort of this big phenomenon, and it can sometimes seem like a fad, even though it's a 2,600-year tradition. And so today I want to just sort of survey you all as we begin this conversation together and think about how you're starting to conceptualize or practice mindfulness in your everyday lives. So the first question I have is, is mindfulness coloring? So coloring, the mindfulness coloring fad, they have sold billions of coloring books across the world. And sometimes when you hear that keyword mindfulness, maybe you think about coloring. Or maybe you think that if you were to practice mindfulness, you need to drink kombucha, that you need to sort of be a yoga person, or someone that has a lot of mindfulness apps on your phone. So there's sort of all of these kind of popular references to mindfulness, and a lot of times it seems like such a simple concept, but hard to unpack and really understand how we can implement it in today's really busy world. So as we begin our conversation today, I wanted you to think about the way that you're kind of arriving to this conversation. Why are you interested in mindfulness, and how have you come to start to define it yourself and or practice it within your everyday lives? I've been really lucky to have the opportunity to kind of do a deep dive in terms of studying mindfulness and also working to apply it in my own life. And I wanted to share with you just a bit of the kind of academic definition. And of course, like any kind of concept, right? There's lots of ways that scholars and practitioners think about what mindfulness is. So just a couple, as you think about your own keywords, I wanted to share some of the keywords that are kind of really most present within the literature that help us to understand it. So the first is this idea that it's a state of active consciousness. And this state actually helps us to be able to observe, acknowledge, and accept our feelings, thoughts, and sensations without judgment. So I don't know about you, but when I think about my own life or the lives of my students or those that I've served in therapy, that's a tall order. It's very easy for us to take the bait of our raw emotions or our first thoughts that emerge in our mind and not necessarily pass judgment on them very quickly. So it's that ability to sort of use what we call metacognition which is just a way of saying we're able to think about our thinking and really create an awareness of what types of thoughts that we're either, thinking about, or that are sort of becoming patterns and behaviors for us. The second component of mindfulness is this idea that it helps us to foster greater presence with both positive circumstances. So one way you could think about this is that, so many times we can get distracted or not even just really relish in positive moments and experiences, or to celebrate our successes because we're so overstimulated or so ready to jump into the next thing that a lot of times we're not even paying attention to really positive experience or sensory input or just our relationships or the things that we can be grateful for. The other side of mindfulness is that it also helps us to tolerate unpleasant seasons of life, difficult moments, and things that are very disruptive for us. So it helps us, again, through that non-judgmental stance, to embrace something called impermanence. So impermanence is just a fancy way of saying that we know nothing in life is permanent, that things don't stay the same, that we're constantly in a state of flux. And therefore, when we're in a very difficult state, we know that we will eventually kind of return to homeostasis, or that we will find coping mechanisms and resources and community to heal in. And so mindfulness really helps us have that awareness to not pass judgment or feel like we're going to stay in a locked state forever. I want to share with you just a little bit in terms of the context of this work for me. As Sarah mentioned, I graduated in 2000 from BU. I'm a proud School of Social Work alum. And that really shaped, at that time I was doing a lot of thinking about, the gravity of the work. When any of us are involved in leadership roles or caregiving roles or service roles or people work, a lot of times that can promote a sense of, burnout and just knowing what the conditions and the needs are across the world. I really became curious and compelled to want to make a life where I could, just help elevate the human condition. So for the last 22 years, I've worked in the mental health outpatient realm, both in community settings and outpatient, and really started to see a lot of patterns in terms of the things that we all as human beings across the world really grapple with. And that led me to enter into higher education 10 years ago, because I really started to see those lived experiences and patterns around self-doubt or just difficulty with the overstimulation of the environment. And I wanted to learn more, and I wanted to really, be an agent of change and help us to rethink a lot of the ways in which the environment is sort of baiting us into, act in certain kinds of ways, or hold ourselves to perfectionistic expectations, or just feel that sense we always have to be on 24/7. So I went on to really get involved and become a resilience researcher. So this lens of mindfulness that I'm sharing today, comes from a lot of the recent research and the writing that I've been doing to really look at the mindless behavior that's often very present in our world, and to rethink it and to work to go through a process of unlearning and relearning ways to be more humane with ourselves and with one another. One of the things I've also done in my public platform is to talk about my own lived experience within my high demand roles, and also having a lived experience of perfectionism and anxiety and depression, and really, understanding for myself as a mental health clinician that I always advocate for people to reach out when they need it and to destigmatize mental health. And I felt that I could use the opportunities I have now to share to really demystify and destigmatize that, and just talk from a very honest and open level about what my experiences are. And last night I was in Boston at an event. One of the things I was saying is that I always wish that I could kind of pull together all the people that I've worked with over time in therapy into a room. And I feel like if everyone was able to listen to each other, they'd see those common threads in their stories, the challenges they were having being mindful, the challenges they were feeling in terms of stewing in anxiety or self-doubt or self-sabotage. So I just want to just, let that be real and let that be known, because I think a lot of times we can see the versions of ourselves, we can see letters after someone's name, or we can sort of have an image. But I think in our shared humanity, most of us, I think the reason mindfulness is so popular is because most of us are really wrestling with what does it mean to show up in this world and give it our best while we're still sustaining ourselves and avoiding the burnout that's become the mainstay of today. So in my research, I've spent a lot of time kind of looking at what are the unique characteristics of our world that beg us to be mindful. And one thing that's amazing is that we have unprecedented opportunities and access to knowledge. So sometimes they're even calling that like infobesity. They're saying that we're taking in the equivalent of 174 newspapers a day, right? And I think, I think about like our young people today, they think by age 5, they have to have their college choice picked out. By age 12, they have to start their own nonprofit. By the time they're 20, they have to have a startup. And I think like, for me, again, as a first generation student, I've been really energized and really tried to seize the opportunities of today to connect, to travel, to learn, to grow, to just, have that upward mobility. But I think sometimes it can have an extreme effect. And sometimes we can sort of, again, come to an understanding that we have to do all in order to be worthy or okay. So I think it's important for us to look at the context, especially in what I would call a hyper-competitive global market where we're competing for admissions to college and jobs. And there's just so much access to that level of pressure that sometimes we can feel like we have to perform like robots or machines in order to kind of just stay ahead. And a lot of us feel like we're falling behind and have a sense of like under accomplishment, even when we're doing quite well. Another piece of today's context, they're actually calling it the age of anxiety. They're saying 1 in 3 of us are showing up with clinical signs of anxiety. And today's workplaces are even being called modern hazards. Furthermore, the World Health Organization has declared a mental health crisis. They're saying that by the year 2030, that stress-related illness and lifestyle sickness is going to surpass communicable disease. So what that means for us is that, we used to be worried that we might catch something and whatnot, but now we're worried about the ravages of stress really just eroding, the quality of our lives and our capacity to really be present with ourselves and one another. And I think that really is so much of why we have such a strong appetite for mindfulness. I know we have a wonderful audience today. Again, many of you from around the world thinking about how do you sort of make sense of this really amazing landscape that's rife with opportunity, but also to taper it and to set the healthy boundaries in order to not be at risk for burnout and just that constant never enough feeling. Another piece of the landscape, when we kind of look at the literature and we look at the data, one of the things that's being discussed is we sort of have this strange element of like what they call paradoxical connectedness. So it's sort of this idea that we're alone together, that like we have more means of communicating than ever. I don't know about you, but I probably have 10 email accounts and there's like 15 ways to probably get in touch and then some more, right? And so we sort of have this thing, we can get in touch with anyone in a heartbeat. But I think a lot of us also are so buried in our work or just sometimes so overwhelmed that we can feel very alone. And I'm sure many of you have seen it, whether you're out to dinner, people sometimes are just on their phones. They're not really connected in that human contact kind of way as much as we once were. They're actually calling loneliness the new smoking of today. The new health risk is that more than ever across the lifespan, not just people, historically we've thought of people who are aging to be lonely because maybe they've lost partners or people in their lives or job roles. We're seeing younger than ever people feeling isolated and fragmented and just not feeling that sense of community and connection. I mentioned the word infobesity, but again, that whole idea that our brains are just gorged with so much information and so much to keep up with that we're not giving ourselves the kind of respite that we really need to sustain ourselves. And then finally, this idea of choice paralysis, right? It's almost, we could do anything we want. And sometimes that can be really exciting, but it can also be provocative. And what I have seen a lot in my clinical work and in helping my students sort of think about what are their career paths going to look like and what choices do they want to make. Sometimes the sheer vast array of choices can actually prove overwhelming and it can get someone stuck. So I want to just share today, just some strategies, some ideas, and then obviously we're going to be opening up the conversation with you all today to take questions. But one of the key things that I want you to sort of just reflect on as I've shared so far is that a lot of times it's easy for us to kind of lock down in our own mind's eye as about like how we're coping or how we're practicing mindfulness. But it's always very important to think about that greater context and how we're interfacing with it and how it's bearing down upon us. I think that a lot of the times we can do something called decontextualizing ourselves, which is just a way of saying like we sort of just think it's just us. We just think we're the only ones that are sort of wrestling with these things, or we don't really recognize that these are sort of the modern context of today. So one thing I want to emphasize is that because we have this changing world, again, where change is really the only constant in our lives, we really need to be able to think from an agile perspective, and we need to really develop, agile thinking and behavior skills, and to really, again, be able to sometimes pivot away from some of the messaging that's baiting us in to always be in a hyper performance mode or engage in mindless kinds of behaviors. And I wanted to share with you today just a quote that I think kind of helps captures the essence of this. And it says, "And every day the world would drag you by the hand, yelling, 'This is what's important, and this is important. You need to worry about this.' And each day it's up to you to yank your hand back and say, 'No, this is what's important.'" And I want to share with you just a couple pieces of my research and some story around this, just to help you think about, what would it mean to practice mindfulness, and how might I set up the boundaries in my life that I can actually create the space for it, to be intentional about it, and to really infuse it into my daily life and my daily work. I wrote an article once in Psychology Today that would said, why waiting for your next vacation to unwind might be dangerous. And the point there is that, at Harvard, they talk a lot about break rituals, but how do we have those mindful moments? How do we practice self-care and self-compassion and respite? And how do we weave that in? I don't know about you, but if you ever go on a vacation, you wait for it, you get excited, and then you go on vacation, you get sick, or someone throws up on you, or you break your ankle, or something goes wrong. I think we wait for that break in, our schedules, but oftentimes, sometimes those moments, whether it's a holiday or vacation, they're not everything. So we need to build it in order to sustain ourselves on a daily basis. So I want to just share with you a little story. I don't know, it looks like my PowerPoint might be crashing, but I'll continue to speak as I just pull it back up again. I'm not sure why it did that, but there's a story of a guy from Silicon Valley in California, and his name is Shaw, and he worked for Atari. So for those of you that were in the 80s, you know that Atari was one of the first video games, and he had actually created the Indiana Jones Atari game back in the 80s, and it was a smashing success. So then he found himself at age 23 eye to eye with movie producer Steven Spielberg, who then wanted him to create the E.T. video game. And what happened was, on the first video game that was so successful, he was given a full year to create this game. But for the second game that he was contracted to do, there was a lot of haggling going back and forth between Spielberg and Atari. And it really it creeped in on the deadline. And instead of having a year to work on it, he was given a six-week window. So you can imagine what happened. He's like, picture yourself in your own work environments, your own roles. You put yourself to task, right? And so he worked day and night, he put it all in, but of course, the product that he created, it wasn't what it could be. So it's for the movie E.T., the E.T. video game. And the game ended up being the worst selling video game of all time, so much so that they had to take all the extra games and put them in a landfill in Mexico. So it was he went from having sort of this pinnacle of his career and this high to completely crashing. But if you look at the situation, it was a ridiculous demand to even expect that someone could produce something of quality within that time. And when we think about today's world, we're expected to be always on. Again, I mentioned a lot of times we're expected to perform like robots or machines, or just do, the work of multiple people in barely any time. And I think, those demands aren't just within our work environment. Oftentimes the research shows it's our outside life and all of our responsibilities and our relationships that are also really demanding. So one thing I want to encourage you to think about with me today, when we think about applying mindfulness, is watching out for always on thinking, this idea that we have to be on 24/7. And it's very, very difficult, particularly for those of us in high demand roles, to sort of set the boundaries around it. But it's important to know and understand how it can actually affect us. And one thing that the American Psychological Association talks about is that we oftentimes don't know how stressed we are until we actually physically get sick. So I saw this a lot in my clinical practice. For example, someone would come in and they would be having heart palpitations, and it would turn out to be anxiety, or they might be losing hair or just losing weight or gaining weight and not feeling themselves. And a lot of times we sort of don't pay attention to the messages of our bodies until we actually physically get sick. So we know that people are more susceptible than ever to burnout and health problems. The other thing is if we're constantly feeling like we have to be on all the time, that can really interfere with the quality of our relationships and just leave us in that state of like, we always have to be, something's urgent, and that state of overwhelm. And the issue with that is our brain often gets locked into thinking something's wrong just by that state of constant adrenaline and cortisol going through our system. And what I've seen a lot in the students that I've served, particularly for this study that I'm basing this work around, is that they're conscientious. They want to do well. They want to hit it out of the park every time, but they also have to be careful. And I saw that for them, they made shifts and they increased their resilience when they moved away from a hyper-performance mindset, that they recognized that, you know, they're human beings, not a human doing, and that always performing and never giving oneself a chance to catch one's breath wasn't necessarily a great recipe for success. And I think a lot of times we're given these ideas about success that can cause us to strive, but to a point that isn't very helpful. So I want to share with you, again, just some ideas about how to actually apply mindfulness if you or someone you love finds yourself in this situation, which again is sort of like the modern classic thing of today, right? But one is just setting boundaries. Knowing, you know, that maybe, again, it might be that you get off your email by a certain time, or that you communicate a certain way with people in your lives if they're sort of overriding, or they're just placing really, really high expectations that just become problematic for you. One way I talk about it in my recent book is cutting our puppet strings. So the idea that sometimes we want to perform and we want to do well, but we have to be careful who we let hold our strings. Another reference, kind of a metaphor that you could think about for those of you that eat steak, and I apologize to anyone that doesn't, but if you know the difference between well done versus burnt, so if you pictured the way you'd like to have that piece of meat cooked, you know there's only a fine line sometimes between doing what, like having it be well done versus burnt. And that's true of us as people as well. I think that it's sometimes really hard to see those degrees of separation. And I know when I have the chance, I travel across the world and I get the chance to work with a lot of schools and nonprofits and companies. And I think that's the key thing. We want to take advantage, you know, of the opportunities of today and to strive well and to, you know, we have this opportunity to do amazing things, but knowing the difference between putting it full in, but also holding something in our reserve that helps sustain our health, our whole health and well-being, and that again is sustainable. And one way that my students and I talk about it is you would never sprint through a marathon, right? You would, you know, have your certain proper measures you take and pacing, and you'd have your, you know, your water breaks and that kind of thing. Another way we could think about this is deliberate self-care, being really intentional about nurturing yourself, nourishing yourself, mind, body, and soul. So really just paying attention to the thing, you know, I always say there's not a one size fits all, but find out, you know, what are the things that really help anchor you. So I always encourage just basic protocol. Don't skip over the basic things like sleep. You know, when our brains are more well rested, we're so much more apt to be present with each other, focused. And when they're not, the anxiety meter is just so much likely to be activated. When we practice self-care, we're really making that deliberate, concerted effort to keep ourselves healthy within a context where the risk factors are really very high, you know, to deplete us. And you'll see this key word on the screen, eudaimonia, which I love. It's a way that positive psychologists talk about the good life, and it's called human flourishing. So it's this idea that we're really focused on doing well, not just, again, by measures of so-called success, but that we feel well and that we can really have a wonderful quality of life. I've mentioned already this idea of taking break rituals. So even if it's just that you're actually stopping to enjoy your coffee and you're paying attention to it and you're absorbing it, or you're getting up from your desk and taking a walk. Another key word is lifestyle medicine. So that's just a fancy way of saying, again, proper sleep, nutrition, movement, community, connection. All those things we know really affect our bottom line. One of the best ways that we can really ensure that we keep on track with mindfulness and self-care is to form dynamic circles. And this is just a way of saying that we are engaging in community, that we're working alongside people who care about us, that hold us accountable for, you know, making sure that we're taking care of ourselves, and just being, you know, really enriched by diverse circles in our lives, to not be isolated. It's very easy, again, just in the sheer force of having a time crunch, to just not make the time for our relationships. But we know that that is something that really helps to elevate us. And then the final thing is adopting an impact mindset. And this is something that really came very clearly out of my research, that rather than having that performance mindset, having an impact mindset is what really helps us to flourish. So the idea there is that, we can look at our strengths and our abilities and capacities as serving the greater context as global citizens. We know that the science of human flourishing and of the brain really shows if we're more focused, like if we kind of move from the me to the we, and we focus on, not just being hypercritical of ourselves or pressured, but if we find ourselves in community and we find our activities and our values lined up with what we're doing, we're going to really do a lot better than if we're just sort of like striving for the sake of striving or just individual accomplishment. So I'm going to move us to the next slide. And I just want to stop and just have you pause for a moment. I think this is something we can talk about in the Q&A. But I think it's, I know it's hard with a large group for all of us, but thinking about ways that you might be avoiding mindless behavior. And this is something that you could think about with people in your life. You could have conversation later when you sign off of this webinar. But I think it's important to already think about what you're doing, how you're already setting boundaries. What are the high impact self-care activities that you're already experiencing and you're already practicing? And maybe what are some things that you could add to your repertoire? What are some things that you could just keep encouraging yourself to do and keep practicing? And so I'm just gonna, let you think about that for a second. And then I want to share with you just a psychology experiment that many of you might have heard about. It's pretty famous. It's the Stanford Marshmallow Test. And this kind of, to me, makes me think a lot about how sometimes we can be apt to engage in mindless behavior or impulsive behavior. And again, a lot of this is because of our primitive instincts. I don't know about you, but sometimes my mind just wants to go, 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 or it's easy for me to, not take that step back. So in the experiment, what the researchers did is they sat kids down and they let them know that if they rang the bell right away, they could have the marshmallow treat right away. But if they waited and the researcher stepped out of the room and the child waited, they would get 2 treats when they finally came back, but there was a waiting period. And of course, you can picture if you have kids in your life, or you can picture yourself as a child, a lot of them were pressing the button pretty quick, and it was very hard for them to control their impulses. What happened later on with this study is they actually went back and looked at the children they had been kids. They looked at them in their adult life to sort of take a look at like how their impulse control was going and if there were sort of similar parallels. And they did indeed find that the kids who had struggled really went on to kind of become the adults that struggled. And so the idea here is that, we in our world are very really overwhelmed many times by messages of marketing about something called what I would call the goods life. So sort of these ideas of consumerism and, buying and that the stuff we have, that gives us a sense of identity or gives us a sense of status, or that those are the things that are going to be the pleasures of life that really make us happy. And we see this worldwide. If we look at like rates of plastic surgery or rates of spending, they say that we actually throw away 90% of what we buy within the first 6 months. So there's a lot of like this consumption and this sort of idea that we're going to fill ourselves and that we're going to sort of make ourselves happy by these kinds of things, by like, the impulse of our brain to sort of soothe ourselves. Again, when we look worldwide, they're saying that we're the most medicated, obese, and addicted group ever worldwide. So it's very easy when we're overwhelmed and we're sort of in these environments that are high demand and we have a lot of pressure on ourselves to sort of try to comfort and soothe ourselves by all these kinds of things. And what we know is that, again, those are not the things that help us to practice mindfulness, and those are not the things that truly fill us up. So just to share a couple of the strategies that came up around sort of how do we resist this idea. And again, so much of the theme was around like success, right? So it was like, how much money do you have? How many letters do you have after your name? What's your status? How many likes on your feed? How nice is your handbag? How good do you look, kind of thing. But what my research showed is that instead of really focusing on that and sort of the impulses of our brains, when we align our values to our behaviors, when we really focus more from that impact lens and that bigger picture of appreciation of why we're here, and knowing that those things don't fill our voids, and that like the things that sometimes we amass or have, they seem like they give us identity. I call it acquired identity in my work, but it really isn't the good life that positive psychologists define, that they say is characterized by connection, mindfulness, presence, flourishing. So I encourage you to, sort of strive for the good life, not the goods life. And again, that mindless behavior, there's a big connection to that in terms of what drives us. We can be very alert and very, very driven by image and sort of filling ourselves and soothing ourselves. And we always want to work to find ways to soothe ourselves that are more lasting and more substantive. So I think this is another reason why, in addition to mindfulness becoming so popular, minimalism has become very popular. People are saying less is more, be more simple, really appreciate the true treasures and values of life. So it's just something to think about. How could we reduce our consumerism? One way the science is really revealing is practicing gratitude, appreciation for what we have, or someone might say counting their blessings. In Buddhism, they call it avoiding the hungry ghost. So the hungry ghost is like that part of ourselves that we always sort of crave things and need things, but they don't necessarily keep us filled. And in psychology, we would call this the hedonic treadmill, that we tend to return to the same happiness set point. Even like, you might think if I get this raise and I make 30% more, that's going to be it. We're sort of looking for that golden ticket. But if we learn to sort of avoid those kinds of traps and really think about a deeper, more substantive way of connecting to ourselves and one another, we know that is what the science shows really can help us. The final point on sort of this idea of consumerism is being generous with our money and time. And I don't know if anyone has ever heard of Lynn Twist, but she talks about the soul of money and talks from a philanthropic lens. So we know the more we give, the better off we are. And just spending our money or just acquiring things isn't necessarily going to be what keeps us healthy and happy. Finally, I want to just share another key point that came out of my research. And in a moment, I'm going to also open up for questions. But it's this idea, and I think the screen is being a little funky, but I'll just let you know what it says. It says that everything is learning and learning is everything. And it's just this idea that as we sort of do this shifting from me to we, and we work to practice mindfulness more deliberately and intentionally, we open our minds up that we don't have to be perfect, that even difficulties or setbacks, we can, again, with mindfulness, it teaches us to tolerate distress and to cope with that. We can sort of see ourselves as learning and growing and developing across time, and that all of our experiences really can be great teachers for us. And that just opening our eyes up to the learning that we can have and, around these things, because again, our environments can sort of reinforce these messages in such intensive ways. It can be very hard to sort of detoxify that and to really be at a space where we can be more self-compassionate, where we can be more present with each other, and we can learn to sort of navigate and be agile through these complexities of life. Yeah, so this was just, again, another key piece out of the research and just the work, and just how do we sort of embrace this kind of perspective. So that idea that everything is learning and learning is everything, and again, just being more gentle and self-compassionate in terms of how we're approaching ourselves and one another. And the final quote I want to leave you with as we prepare to open for questions and discussion, again, we could do lots of yoga, we could do lots of meditation, we could color, we could do a lot of things, but it's really important that we don't lose sight of, again, how we're interfacing with this context of today. So this is just a quote from my recent book that says, mindfulness isn't a drive-through option for quick relief. We need to be careful not to jump on a bandwagon, grab our fix, and then head right back down the same path that begged us to be mindful in the first place. So just really want to encourage you on this, in terms of, how do you align your values to your behaviors, and how do you set the boundaries you need, and how do you practice self-care and self-compassion and give yourself permission to put the brakes on when you need to. And one thing I always encourage my students and those I serve to think about is, practicing from a universal precautions lens. So you don't have to necessarily feel like you're terribly anxious or overwhelmed or, at that point, to really just say, I need to do these practices. And I think another major reason that mindfulness has gained so much attention is now we have the scientific backing to show its positive effects on our brains. We know that it helps to mitigate anxiety and depression. We know that it increases endorphins and serotonin, and that it really just, even like lots of companies are really starting to institute it within their own practices, because we understand that our brains are not meant to be on a screen all day long, or our bodies are not meant to be in a chair all day long, or we're not just meant to like barely get any sleep or nourish ourselves. So I think people are paying attention because, again, it's needed, but also because the science is really demonstrating how important it is. But again, we could do these things kind of passively, but it's really important. What I found is, how do we integrate it into our daily routine and really be intentional? And for those of you who are leaders in your respective organizations or in your personal life and personal roles, just encouraging, how do we have conversation around this kind of stuff and embed it into our institutional culture or into our family culture. I know so many parents of today who feel so pressured to have their kids in like 18 activities by the time they're 2 years old. And I think, there's just so much pressure like to keep up, but is it really worth keeping up if it compromises our health? And as the World Health Organization says, there's no health without mental health. And I would also say there's no success without mental health. And mindfulness just can really become a way for us to, regroup and recenter and just be more like humane to ourselves and one another. And I think that the other beauty is that companies are really recognizing and seeing the very positive effects on this on employees in terms of, they're calling it now presenteeism and absenteeism and just overall outcomes. We know when we nourish ourselves and we institute these practices, they really help us cope with the complexity of life and to really harness the great moments and also be able to navigate the challenging ones. So I just want to let you know, on my website, I do have lots of different handouts and guides, and I have a Mentelligence quiz to kind of test your mindfulness and other components of health. And I'm very active on social media, so I'll turn it back over to Sarah, but we're all community as a BU network, and I'm so grateful for that. And I hope this has been kind of provocative and just gets you thinking and adding on to the things that you're already doing. And you see my hashtag only we, but we can only accomplish these things in community, particularly when the context can be, just so jarring sometimes to our minds. So I just really am excited to connect with everyone today and just share these small slices from my clinical work and research and my teaching. And I wish you all the best.
Chris, thank you so much. And I want to remind everyone that you can send your questions in now using the box. So just hover over the bottom of your screen. You'll see the Q&A box. You can type in there. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, we have a comment that came in earlier, a suggestion from an alum who has been listening in. She said, I avoid mindless behavior with a way that I heard a while back. I have a colored Post-it hidden in my office. And every time I see it, it reminds me to be mindful for just a minute and brings me back to the present moment.
Wonderful. I love that.
And we have a comment and question from Mary. She says, there seems to be a decline in basic civility. Does this relate to mindfulness?
Mm-hmm. So I think the question was, is a decline in basic civility? Yes, yes, yes. So that's a deep concern. It's another piece of the recent writing and advocacy and activism that I've been doing because, and that's such an important piece to this conversation, our very polarized socio-political landscape where so much negativity and toxicity are coming through our feeds and, there's just not any dialogue happening, and that's really bearing down upon us. And I think one way that we can be mindful is to recognize, again, that movement from me to we. How could we be people who are, thoughtful and conscious and, try to look for, in my book, I talk about something called ethics of reciprocity. So that just means the golden rule and seeing ourselves as loving our neighbors and being global citizens and stop thinking we have to protect territory, but trying to find common ground and common values and looking for what we would call intersectionality, which is what could be like our common things in our lived experiences. and how might we then use that for empathy and understanding of one another, and how we could recognize that a lot of the social institutions and, you know, whether it's governments or other things, can be so negative, and they can drive us to think we have to be on a team and fight against each other, rather than looking at the bigger systemic issues that we should be trying to tackle together. So thank you for that question, because it's a very, very important one. And I think so many of us are deeply affected by that lack of positive discourse and working together for shared goals, and even a desire to look for that. Many people have become very unable to do that in today's landscape.
This one is very interesting. I'm curious. Comment on choosing a personal focus or grounded, regrounding habit. Let me read that again. Comment on choosing a personal focus, grounded, regrounding habit, and returning to unborn state. I definitely need an expert for that one, because I'm not sure what that question means.
I might have missed a little bit of the question, so could you just repeat it one more time, please?
Sure. And you can also click that Q&A so you can read it.
Oh, okay. There we go. Okay.
Yeah. Comment on choosing a personal focus, grounded, regrounding habit, and returning to unborn state.
Okay. Thank you, Neil, for the question. Good. And I have it open too, so thank you. So I think what I found in terms of like choosing habits, I think that everybody, you know, has different things that work for high impact. And what I would say is that, you know, one of the most basic things that can be really helpful is breath work when it comes to mindfulness practices. So meditation and breath work, to really allow that space and to really, you know, have that cleansing aspect from the body, mind, body, spirit perspective. And just allowing, like, you know, if you think about like consciousness and mindfulness and that connection of going into those, you know, there's lots of like levels of mindfulness and states. I think it's important for each person to sort of start, like if you're starting at a beginning level or advanced level, to pick, maybe start with breath work or guided meditations. I even, you know, I mentioned apps before. I like Calm and Buddhify. I really like Michael Seeley's meditations on YouTube rather. But I think those things can kind of help us bring us back to that essence. You call it an unborn state, but that sense of just inner child, or just, you know, those kinds of experiences that mindfulness can bring us towards. So I hope that's helpful, and don't hesitate to have a follow-up if I wasn't understanding the question all the way.
Oh, another question. We can be conscious of incorporating mindfulness for ourselves. How can we instill mindfulness into our children starting from infancy?
Mm-hmm. I love it. It's such a great question. And I think, again, I think today, I've written a lot about this in Psychology Today in terms of, you know, just how mindfulness can I wrote an article that says, you know, can mindfulness save the day for pressured parents? I think that it really does begin, for those of you who are parents, or you have young people in your life, or maybe you're teaching or mentoring. It sounds very simple, but I think just that modeling of practice. So the more that you're able to be present with yourself and to put those practices into play, I think that that's something that they're going to pick up on, even from like that nonverbal level. They're going to see that. I know lots of families who do a great job in terms of like just really watching out with technology boundaries and caution around screen time, and just, you know, they're watching us, right, from an early age. So just being mindful of what you're doing. And then I think also just recognizing, again, we want our children to do well and to take advantage of opportunities and be well-rounded and all those things. But just reminding them, again, like their worth and their value isn't what they do, it's who they are. So I think that can be helpful. I think getting kids breathing, yoga practices, all the things, I think just from an early age, it can really matter. And I think it's just great that you're thinking about that, because, you know, what could that look like if we're starting to practice that at such an early age? I think it's vital. I see another question, so I'll just go right ahead, if that's okay with Sarah. So mindfulness is a skill all global citizens could develop, but it becomes an issue when dealing with intercultural issues, particularly if people emphasize religious issues like Buddhism versus Islamic beliefs. So how do you address these intercultural issues? So I'm so glad you brought this up. So in my Intelligence book, today I focus on, the pieces from the mindful lens. And the very next lens, so this is a perfect segue, is the global lens. And it's how do we adopt this mindset? And what happened with my research, I was working with students from around the world of all different cultures, all different faith backgrounds, families of origins, communities of origins. And so we really did a lot of discussion around this and looking at, when I looked across so many of the frameworks, again, that idea of ethics of reciprocity came up. That the idea that most frameworks say that they want to promote peace and love your neighbor, do unto others as you would have done to them. I read the Dalai Lama's book called, I think it was like, not the ethics of religion, but forgive me for blanking out, but it's this idea that it's not like, a lot of times people are obviously throughout the sands of time, people feel that they have to if they have a very strong conviction, then it becomes like one group against the other, and it becomes a very polarized, contentious issue, obviously. But I think it's really important to be able to say across culture, across religious frameworks, where can we find those common values and that common ground, and see that. And one of the things I talk about in my book is not letting principles stand in the way of outcomes. So we can stand so staunchly and we can fight so hard and not realize that, except for the people on the extremes that are often broadcast in the news, right? Like the stereotypes or these ideas about extremes. I think most people with positive intentions want those same things. They want human connection and love, and to be mindful, and to be free, and to be connected, and all those things. So I think it's very important when there's these kinds of conflicts. I always say that territory is always at the heart of every conflict. And we have to work to unlearn that and to really look at our own biases, our own centric ideas, whether they're egocentric or sociocentric, and to be able to say, I've been trained to believe like my way is the precise way, or like this is the only way. We can get very fixated on those ideas. But I think it's also important to use our minds, use mindfulness, use our metacognition to be able to take a step back and say, where are the common threads and what could we agree on? And how do I also think about just how do we maybe even agree to disagree and find our way. And I love the concept of pluralism, right? To be able to entertain all of the so-called differences. I also really advocate my work is to look for the beauty in human spectrum, to really look for the strengths in each other, and to look to work to reduce our biases and our blind spots about each other. Because a lot of those have just been so amplified and reinforced for so long. And we're sort of inheriting a fight that we didn't begin in the first place. I think millennials sometimes get beat up a lot on in the culture, like people give them a hard time. But I think that they're the most open, loving, just open to diversity and diverse perspectives. And we just see that overwhelming in the data. And I think that's just such a healthy thing. And I think if we could all strive for that, to look for the beauty in each other and the shared values and how we might work together, I think that could mean a tremendous amount. So thank you for that question. Michael Seeley, I think you spelled it right. Michael Seeley, you spelled it right. S-E-A-L-E-Y on YouTube. Just a really good, it's really nice guided meditations. And Beautify, I'm not sure what that is. So just, Buddhify. So Buddhify is the app. So it's Buddha, I-F-Y. Okay, so any ideas for simple implementation of introducing mindfulness on a large scale in high schools? Yes. So this might be our last question. I'm not sure, but Sarah, it's okay for me to answer this? Okay, so this past April, there was a whole conference by the Learning and the Brain on mindfulness in New York. So there are tons of things happening within schools. I often go to schools to work with really instituting it. And so working, to get the professional development for everybody in the building is really important, to know what it is, and then how to institute those practices in the classrooms and to teach it to the teachers and the staff and to everybody, including the leaders, and then really teaching it to the students. So I know that's a simplified answer, but if you want to reach out, I can point you in the direction of some additional resources for that, or talk more about how to do it. But lots of schools are getting great traction by encouraging that, especially in light of the AP testing and higher state, all the things that, high school students get, like no sleep. There's just so much pressure on everybody in the school community, all the way down the pipeline. So They're also using mindfulness interventions in lieu of like disciplinary measures. And when we think about the pipeline to prison phenomena, they're taking like less punitive measures and really trying to teach students coping skills and mindfulness skills in order to really affect positive outcomes as well. So I think just educating yourselves about what it is, bringing it to administration, and really trying to advocate to have that kind of professional development for the community and institution within the culture could really make a difference. Awesome questions and engagement.